Testing, testing. Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3. Mary. Sorry, please keep chatting amongst yourselves. We just want to make sure you're awake.
Welcome, everyone. I think we'll go ahead and get started. We're really glad you're here. My name is Liesl Olson, and I work here at the library, where I'm Director of Chicago Studies. And I can't tell you how excited I am for tonight's program on the literature of Bronzeville. We've got two extraordinary people here with us tonight, Ewing and Ken Warren, who I'm going to tell you a little bit about in a moment, and who are going to share with us their thinking and their creative work about the Red Summer of 1919 and the language that emerged out of Chicago from our writers and our poets in the decades following that moment. Tonight's program, which we're live streaming, fits into a much larger set of citywide conversations that have been happening nearly every month since this past February at venues across the city, from the DuSable Museum, where we launched our first event in February, to City Bureau, the Harold Washington Library, and the Chicago History Museum. We did an amazing bike ride through the South Side with over 200 people, starting at the 29th Street Bridge and moving through the city. We worked with young Chicago authors. It's really been an extraordinary civic effort. And I want to thank all of our collaborating partners, 13 of them. They're all listed on the back of your program. And a special thanks to the National Endowment for the Humanities. I'm really happy to see a lot of folks here from our partner institutions. So I want to talk a little bit about the 1919 race riots and also give you some literary history around this moment. Many people know, but perhaps many people do not know, that the Chicago race riots were the most violent week in Chicago history, sparked by the death of Eugene Williams, an African-American teenager who was stoned and drowned to death for floating his raft over an invisible line into a whites-only Southside beach. And I show this image of Eugene Williams from the Chicago Defender, and I want to remember him. It's the only image of Williams that we've been able to find. Here's another image from the very start. Well, I'll go backwards a little bit. There we go. It's moving now without me. There we go. Here's another image from the very start of the riots. The police refused to arrest and prosecute the white man who killed Eugene Williams. And the city of Chicago, which was already seething with racial tensions, then erupted in arson and looting and in 38 deaths. 23 blacks died and 15 whites, and nearly 500 people were injured. The Chicago race riots were part of the Red Summer, a period of peak violence against African Americans across the country in small towns and big cities, including Elaine, Arkansas, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Washington, D.C. In Chicago, a young photojournalist named Jun Fujita took vivid photographs of the riots. Fujita immigrated to Chicago from Japan, and he lived here when there were very few other Japanese Americans living in Chicago. He was neither black nor white, and his photographs of the riots give us some sense of how his racial identity, his insider-outsider status, allowed him rare access to the violence across Chicago. Here's one of his photographs where we see a white mob, members of a so-called athletic association, throwing rocks at African Americans. And in another photograph, we see, again, a white mob that has looted an African American home in Bronzeville. There are many, many more photographs that he took, quite disturbing photographs that I didn't want to show tonight in this venue, but you can see them at the Chicago History Museum, and we've also put them up on our website. Now, just what was Fujita's point of view, literally from behind his camera lens? We're going to explore this question in an upcoming exhibition here at the Newberry this spring, which the Poetry Foundation is bringing to us. And it's just one of the exciting collaborations that has come out of these series of conversations that have been taking place all year. So Fujita worked with Carl Sandburg at the Chicago Daily News. They were both reporters there. And Sandburg wrote about the riots during his beat covering labor and politics on the South Side. And then he collected those articles into this book. Sandburg's book is clear-eyed, it's plain-spoken, and it's threaded through with stories of Chicagoans living with daggers drawn. Both Fujita and Sandberg were part of an interracial group of bohemian artists in Chicago who dreamed that racial progress could be part of the avant-garde aesthetic experiments of the modernist movement. Now, by the 1930s, the Works Progress Administration helped support both white and black writers, including Richard Wright and Margaret Walker, who worked on the Illinois Writers Project together, and Frank Marshall Davis, who was part of the Southside Writers Group along with Wright and Walker. The Southside Writers Group wrote one of the most important literary manifestos to come out of Chicago, which is the 1937 Blueprint for Negro Writing, which you can find online. And in this manifesto, they argue that writing should be for and about the black working classes. The 1930s and 1940s were a time of incredible literary ferment in Chicago. In 1945, Gwendolyn Brooks publishes A Street in Bronzeville, and her high school friend, Margaret Burroughs, is organizing at the Southside Community Arts Center, where they had both taken an influential writing class with a teacher named Inez Stark. Now, Burroughs, of course, was a visual artist, an activist, and she founded the DuSable Museum. Which is to say, the literature of Bronzeville was supported by some key institutions on the South Side. The freedom to experiment may be a state of mind, but it's also a structural position created by funding and institutions. Writers found freedom at the George Cleveland Hall Branch Library, the intellectual hub of the neighborhood, presided over by the amazing librarian Vivian Harsh, who you see right here in the middle at the desk. Freedom was also found at the Southside Community Arts Center, just up the street, which held art classes and poetry workshops, including the one taken by Brooks and Burroughs, which you see pictured on the left. Now, if you think about somebody like Gwendolyn Brooks, remember that when she got the call that she had won the Pulitzer Prize in 1950, and this was for her second collection of poetry, Annie Allen, they called her, apparently, at Hall Branch Library because they knew that that's where they would find her. Now, one question that I've often puzzled over is why the literary works that we often associate with the Red Summer seem to come from writers outside of Chicago. That phrase, Red Summer, comes from the Harlem writer James Weldon Johnson. And it's Claude McKay's 1919 poem, If We Must Die, that urges black readers to fight back against racial violence, which they certainly did in Chicago. And Johnson and McKay are both writers that are associated with the Harlem Renaissance. Now, Ken may touch on this point, that what's happening in the 1920s in Chicago is that some of the most brilliant intellectual energies are working in the field of sociology, which then goes on to powerfully shape the city's writers. Now, consider for a moment the case of Richard Wright, who moves up to Chicago in 1927 from Mississippi, part of the Great Migration, and immerses himself in books at the Hall Branch Library. He reads deeply in the Chicago School of Sociology. He befriends Horace Caton, who becomes co-author of the landmark 1945 book, Black Metropolis. And then Wright goes on to write the introduction to that book, Black Metropolis. It's a really forceful and luminous introduction in which he describes just what the science of sociology did for him. This is what Wright writes in that introduction. Chicago is the city from which the most incisive and radical Negro thought has come. There is an open and raw beauty about that city that seems either to kill or endow one with the spirit of life. I felt those extremes of possibility, death, and hope while I lived half hungry and afraid in a city to which I had fled with the dumb yearning to write, to tell my story. But I did not know what my story was, and it was not until I stumbled upon science that I discovered some of the meanings of the environment that battered and taunted me. So here, Wright underscores the ways in which social conditions informed his psychological condition, the ways that the structures of racism shaped his interior life. Now, one of the most important works or documents to emerge out of the riots is a work of sociology that was essential for a book like Black Metropolis, and which also shaped the literature of Bronzeville. Now, Eve knows a lot about this work, which is called The Negro in Chicago, and which was written by the Chicago Commission on Race Relations. Now, the commission drew on extensive research already undertaken by the brilliant sociologist Charles Johnson, who did most of the writing. The report also made some powerful recommendations calling for more integration, Black inclusion in labor unions, better job opportunities for African Americans, equal housing, and less biased press coverage. Now, many of these recommendations took decades to implement, and of course, others were never implemented. But it did not have to be this way. One of the aims of our 1919 project is to underscore how segregation is not innate. It's not natural, it's not inevitable. It was invented and maintained through a powerful blend of violence, intimidation, and law. Now, what's the role of the literary in all of this? Perhaps it's our writers who transform the times in which they live and create work that gives us the truths of what the world is and what the world could be. To my mind, the literature of Bronzeville reminds us that we can imagine. That is indeed our distinct human capability to imagine, and that this quality may be how we are going to find our way forward. So with that in mind, let me introduce our two speakers tonight, who I should say already know each other pretty well. For Ken Warren was Eve's professor when she was an undergrad at the University of Chicago, and now she is Dr. Eve L. Ewing, the author most recently of the poetry collection 1919 and the nonfiction work Ghosts in the Schoolyard, Racism and School Closings on Chicago's South Side. Her first book, Electric Arches, received awards from the American Library Association and the Poetry Society of America and was named one of the year's best books by NPR and the Chicago Tribune. She's the co-author with Nate Marshall of the play No Blue Memories, The Life of Gwendolyn Brooks. She also writes the Ironheart series, as well as other projects for Marvel Comics. Dr. Ewing is an assistant professor at the University of Chicago School of Social Service Administration. She's been published in many, many, many venues and won so many awards, it's totally overwhelming. She's been on The Daily Show with Trevor Noah, check it out. She's been called the Zora Neale Hurston of her generation. And she's got over 200,000 followers on her Twitter feed, which you should check out for its humor and its brilliance. Professor Ken Warren is Fairfax M. Cone Distinguished Service Professor in the English Department, also at the University of Chicago. He is the author of 3 books, which include the provocatively titled and provocatively argued What Was African American Literature? Also the book So Black and Blue, Ralph Ellison and the Occasion of Criticism, and the book Black and White Strangers, Race and American Literary Realism. These books explore how American literature by Black and white writers helped consolidate and respond to Jim Crow America. Ken is also co-editor of 2 books, Renewing Black Intellectual History and Jim Crow Literature and the Legacy of Sutton E. Griggs. He has written widely in other publications, and I should also add that Ken is a great friend of the Newberry, where he coordinates our seminar in American literature, so we thank you for that. So I'm going to hand over the podium to Ken, who will eventually hand it over to Eve, and then the 2 of them will be in conversation with one another and also in conversation with you. Ken. Ken Warren.
Okay, is that good? Can you hear me? I'd like to start, first of all, by thanking the staff at the Newberry. It's always a great pleasure working with everyone here. They're such a marvelous group, and it's has made my interactions over the years with the Newberry quite a wonderful thing and something I'm happy to do whenever they ask if it's possible to fit it into my to my schedule. And I wanted to thank Liesl in particular for organizing this this event tonight. It's exhilarating and sobering to be sharing the stage with Eve. Someone I've, as Liesl said, I knew first as a student. Exhilarating to see how far she has come and how extraordinary her career has been. Sobering because, damn, I'm getting old. You'll see her running circles around me, I'm sure, in our discussion. By way of getting started, I'll note that one of the scariest thing a professor can say to you at the beginning of a talk is, "I'll try to be brief," because that usually means that they've prepared more than they have time for, and as much as they ought to cut, they believe that because they went through the trouble of writing it, you ought to have to hear it. So, having given you the warning, I'll begin by saying I will try to be brief. And what I'll try to do is actually do some highlighting and context setting, echoing some of the points that Liesl has already made in her wonderful introduction. I'll point out that all professions are subject to their idiosyncratic biases and limitations, and those of us who do literary studies for a living are particularly susceptible to a sense that historical events do not achieve their full realization until they are translated not merely into literary representation, but into lasting contributions and innovations within literature. Now, one reason for this susceptibility, I think, is the rise of literary modernism, broadly speaking, after the First World War, in which some measure of direct participation in the war, either as soldiers, medical staff, journalists, or volunteers, by a significant number of writers, think Ernest Hemingway, Rainier Maria Rilke, Ford Madox Ford, Guillaume Apollinaire, Archibald MacLeish, just to name a few, led to a dramatic transformation in how writers and poets approached literary writing. And in some sense, the dynamic relation between historic, or presumed dynamic relation between historical catastrophe and literary innovation that was modernism has retrospectively shaped how we view earlier moments, in some sense all moments. For example, the title of a book by Daniel Aaron, published in 1973, The Unwritten War, American Writers in the Civil War, almost speaks for itself. That, which is to say, correctly or incorrectly, Aaron wonders why that war, as chronicled by its participants, did not produce masterpieces, so on the order of the texts of the American Renaissance. That is to say, the texts that we associate with the middle of the 19th century were published in the 1850s and not, say, in the 1860s. And to some extent, Aaron was elaborating on an observation made by Edmund Wilson in his 1962 doorstopper of a book, Patriotic Gore, Studies in the Literature of the American Civil War, which opens with the observation that the period of the Civil War was not one in which belles lettres flourished. But, he says, it did produce a remarkable literature which mostly consists of speeches and pamphlets, private letters, personal memoirs, and journalistic reports, which is also to say that for the most part, it produced no lasting novels or poems. Now, Wilson, this is relatively speaking, because Wilson does acknowledge, of course, the greatness of, say, Walt Whitman's poem on Lincoln, When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed. But the broader point is that, taken as a whole, in terms of publicly recognizable literary forms, the Civil War was sort of underwritten, if not entirely unwritten. So why would that be of importance for our discussion today, which is not about the status of Civil War literature, but rather about how can we, or should we think of the Chicago race riot of 1919 as a literary event? Now, a more immediate backdrop to that question, as Liesl alluded to already, is the contrast between, say, Harlem and Chicago. Many have argued that the Harlem Renaissance, or the New Negro movement, should be understood as the literary realization of the events of the Red Summer of 1919, which she has, which Liesl introduced so ably for us with her slides. So Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Gwendolyn Bennett, Jessie Fawcett, Claude McKay, Eric Walren, and so many others, all came to prominence in the decade immediately following the Red Summer, in a way that many have argued should be seen as the realization of the militant resistance to American racism that prompted those deadly conflagrations. So, catastrophic event of a black self-assertion produces a literature of self-assertion that flowers in Harlem would be the argument. But more recently, scholars have suggested that however much we may wish to celebrate the literature of that Renaissance, that it actually represents not a realization of the militancy of 1919, but rather a desire to manage those relations, manage that event by wresting demands for revolutionary transformation into a frame of American race relations. So for example, Henry Louis Gates Jr. and Jean Jarrett, in tracking the history of the term New Negro, which is typically associated with the Harlem Renaissance of the 20s, and they look over a longer history extending back into the late 19th century, note that at least since its usages after Reconstruction, the name New Negro had implied a tension between strictly political concerns and strictly artistic concerns. Alain Locke's appropriation of the name in 1925 for his literary movement, so Locke publishes The New Negro in 1925, which was taken from a special issue of the Survey graphic magazine published before that, and that becomes the kind of signature text of the Renaissance for many. They say Locke's appropriation of the name New Negro represented a measured co-opting of the term from its fairly radical political connotations as defined in magazines like the Messenger, the Kansas City Call, and the Chicago Whip, in bold essays and editorials printed before the First World War post-World War I race riots, in which African Americans ably defended themselves from mob aggression. During the 1920s, the New Negro had indeed undergone changes of the profoundest sort. The two poles of this apparently drastic transformation, however, were present even in the earliest use of the phrase. The sheer resonating preserve and force of this transformation can be gleaned somewhat from the fact that the post-war writings of Alain Locke and his contemporaries saw fit to graft onto its post-war connotations of aggressive self-defense the mythological and primitivistic defense of the racial self that was the basis of the Harlem Renaissance. So they argue that there's actually a kind of break that literature represents, not a realization of militancy, but a management of the idea of race by rooting it in ideas of identity and primitivism. So the cautionary note here is that any desire to see literary representation of important historical events needs to be aware of the possibility that literary realization at different moments in history, while inspired by those events, may itself have a politics at odds with the political motivations of those events. So, if taking our cues first from Gates's and Jarrett's argument that the literature of the Harlem Renaissance turns out to have been the literature of race relations management rather than militant self-assertion, in response to the upheavals of the Red Summer, and then also taking our cue from Edmund Wilson's suggestion that the literature, the key literature of a historical event, may materialize most immediately in non-literary or more ephemeral forms, then we can see that Liesl's opening presentation, which has included, say, Richard Wright's Paean to the Social Science that informed Caton and Drake's Black Metropolis, and then the landmark study, The Negro in Chicago, a study of race relations and the race riot, may give us an answer to the question about the literature of the Chicago race riot, which is to say that literature, the most immediate literature of the race riot, is to be found in the sociology, the journalism, and letters, the more ephemeral documents of the period. This decade was foundational, as Liesl has already pointed out, for the Chicago School of Sociology, established by Ernest Burgess and Robert Park. And as Touré Reed has written, this Chicago School of Sociology equipped Black intellectual and scholars of the period, including members of the Urban League, with powerful tools with which to counter the thrust of eugenics, which is to say scientific racism. The Chicago School race relations models such as notions of social disorganization and reorganization and ethnic cycles ultimately led members, say, of the Urban League to emphasize the needs of middle-class Blacks, as these individuals already possess the cultural and intellectual attributes necessary to demonstrate the racist capacity, the races capacity for assimilation. And I might add that one of the most compelling representations of Black Chicago published during the decade of the 1920s, at least in my view, occurs in a novel by a non-Chicagoan, someone with whom you're all familiar though, W.E.B. Du Bois, whose 1928 novel, calls it a romance, Dark Princess, presents a searing journalistic account of political corruption and the chicanery of Chicago politics that is sandwiched, however, between an improbable international romance. So taking all this together, one might reasonably conclude, as I've already said, that the literary response to the political energies released in 1919 is the management, or the desire to produce a kind of management regime by Black professionals of the social conflicts accompanying Black urban migration. The language of Bronzeville, as we've come to know it, is perhaps best seen in a sense as a response to later upheavals, which most specifically the economic upheavals of the Great Depression and the rise and the way in which that event energized radical politics, particularly here in Chicago. So, but there might be other possibilities. And for that, I'll conclude by glancing briefly at two brief 20th century Black poets. The first is, let's see if I can, oops, yes, here we go. Do this in reverse orders. The first is Robert Hayden, not a Chicago poet, a Detroit poet, but one whose work appeared in an important 1937 issue of the journal New Challenge, which featured several work by several members of the Chicago Southside Writers Group. And the poem is Frederick Douglass, which is up there, and I'll read it aloud. Before I read it, I'll note it's a 14-line poem, a sonnet, but one which challenges a bit what the shape of a sonnet might be. Frederick Douglass by Robert Hayden. When it is finally ours, this freedom, this liberty, this beautiful and terrible thing, needful to man as air, usable as earth, when it belongs at last to all, when it is truly instinct, brain matter, diastole, systole, reflex action, when it is finally won, when it is more than the gaudy mumbo-jumbo of politicians, this man, this Douglass, this former slave, this Negro beaten to his knees, exiled, visioning a world where none is lonely, none hunted alien, this man superb in love and logic, this man shall be remembered. Oh, not with statues' rhetoric, not with legends and poems and wreaths of bronze alone, but with the lives grown out of his life, the lives fleshing his dream of the beautiful, needful thing. Now, the paradox that the poem embodies is that as a poem asking how Douglass might properly be remembered, it asserts the inadequacy of a poem to do that very thing. Right? Not with legends and poems, but with lives grown out of this life. The fact that you have a sonnet that doesn't quite form itself as a sonnet suggests the point of the inadequacy of the literary to fulfill the political dream of freedom that Douglass represents. A consciousness that, as I'm sort of gesturing to the literature of Bronzeville, is a suggestion that part of the point of that literature is to point beyond literature, the inadequacy of literature as an artifact, as an object, to realize its dreams. The one way that you know that Douglass will have properly been remembered is by the fact that individual lives, or of everyone, will reflect the freedom that Douglass represented. We don't need poems. He doesn't quite say that. He says not poems alone, but the strong argument is that we don't need poems. We need individuals living among each other with the richness of freedom, the inadequacy of the poems. And I'd like to turn next to a Chicago poet, and I'll go back to Frank Marshall Davis and his poem, and this is from Chicago's Congo, published in 1931, the title of which references both Carl Sandburg's poem, Chicago, and then Vachel Lindsay's poem, some see as a deeply racist poem in certain ways, The Congo. And this is only an excerpt from it. In the notes for the poem, or at the outset, Davis describes it as a sonata for the orchestra, with the notion of the exposition, exposition, development, and recapitulation, that kind of form. And the poem does indeed follow through on that poem, on that structure. So some of the words here that you see at the end, I mean, in this concluding paragraph, especially the Chicago sings these words each day, Chicago who wears her skyscrapers like a necklace, are the words that are at the beginning of the poem. And I'll just read, let's see, those words up there. Again, this song, just to highlight some of the points here that I think are similar to what Haydn does with Douglas, insisting that this is a sonata. He then insists suddenly, this song has no tune. You cannot hum it. This song has no words. You cannot sing it. This song, everybody knows, nobody knows. It is a pattern of brown faces at the Wabash YMCA, a 35th Street gambling place, a Parkway theater. You get it or you don't. It is a melody of everything and nothing. I saw 12 stars sitting along the edge of a 4-story flat. I saw a moon held by leafless tree fingers. I heard a shot tear huge holes in the blanket of silence. Later, just later, the moon got away and the stars stepped back into the sky. Similarly, a sense of invoking the possibility of form and formal unity, only to insist by form, but also in the way that the words are, in the meaning of the words themselves, of the impossibility of a certain kind of formal realization. Davis was a poet whose career encompassed more than poetry. He was a journalist, an activist, and in some ways his journalism competed with his poetry writing over his career, suggesting, and this is the note I'll conclude on, and hoping that I was brief enough, that the language of Bronzeville is a language of the literary that insists on the insufficiency of the literary for the purpose of human realization. So thank you very much.
Oh my, good evening. I'm cold, so I'm gonna wear my jacket. Hope that's okay. And I also like to time myself when I read. How are you all? Good? Good. So I think, okay, there we go. So before I begin, I'd like to make a land acknowledgement and recognize the fact that we gather this evening on the traditional homelands of the Ho-Chunk, Miami, and Potawatomi peoples, and to think about, as we acknowledge and recognize histories of violence that have rocked our city, to recognize what it means to gather on unceded historical territorial land, and to think about the legacy of settler colonialism and how it intersects with other forms of racialized violence. So I'm going to read some poems from this book that I wrote called 1919. And this is a really special event for me to be able to share work with you, because usually I have to give this long preamble about 1919 and the riot and what it was and the Negro in Chicago. And now I don't have to do any of that because my colleagues have so ably done so. And in particular, what I'd like you to know is that the poems in this book are each in conversation with a passage from the report, The Negro in Chicago. So that's a text that I encountered when I was writing my second book, Ghosts in the Schoolyard, which is a nonfiction book about the closure of Chicago public schools in 2013. And I realized that in order to write that book, I had to understand what had happened in Chicago a century prior and how that shapes the racial fabric of our city. And so I became very obsessed with the Negro in Chicago as a report and decided that I wanted to write these poems as a way of being in conversation with the text. So what I'm going to do in our time together is I'm going to read for each poem a passage from the text, the Negro in Chicago, that you saw the cover page from, and then I'll read the poem that goes with it. The first poem is called The Train Speaks, and it begins with this quotation from the Negro in Chicago. It's a persona poem in the voice of a train bringing black people up from the South during the Great Migration. It begins with this quote: "The presence of Negroes in large numbers in our great cities is not a menace in itself." Good observation. The train speaks. "Even now, I dream of them. Quiet nights in the rail yard when the little rat feet skitter beneath me, when the last of the strong men with his gleaming silver buttons has locked the door and laid his hands against me. I see them dancing in every passing cloud. My babies, my babies. Born unto me in the hills and green lands, loose threads catching in my sharp parts when they don't watch out, blistered hands hauling parcels of burlap as hefty and shapeless as bound cotton. They move like rabbits then. They look for a lash that isn't there, even them that never felt it. It's in their shoulders. The lash lives in their shoulders. Long after the last biscuit is gone, when the sunrise brings steel mountains, my children look and look through the space I have prepared for them, the gift I have made. They are safe within, but can see without. They feel it before they know the words, then smile when it comes to them. It's flat. The land is flat. And they smile to think of it, this new place, the uncle or cousin who will greet them, the hat they will buy, the ribbons. They know not the cold, my babies. They know not the men who are waiting and angry. They know not that the absence of signs does not portend the absence of danger. My children, my precious ones, I can never take you home. You have none. And so you go out into the wind. Thank you. So I wrote in my first book, Electric Arches, there's a poem called True Stories about Coco Taylor. And I'm into like mythologies and what's true and what's not true. And I also have a poem called True Stories about Carl Sandburg, actually, which has never been published. And so this book has a poem called True Stories about the Great Fire. And it begins with this quotation from the Negro in Chicago. The sentiment was expressed that Negro invasion of the district was the worst calamity that had struck the city since the Great Fire. A prominent white real estate man said, property owners should be notified to stand together block by block and prevent such invasion. True Stories about the Great Fire. Everything they tell you is wrong. The Great Fire came here in a pair of worn loafers, eating its last sandwich wrapped in paper, and the Great Fire had a smell like grease and flowers. The Great Fire did not come to eat up the homes. The homes lay down at the feet of the Great Fire, for it was godly and it glowed. The Great Fire blessed the rooftops. The Great Fire danced with the lake shore. The Great Fire has an auntie who makes dresses, and the Great Fire wears a red pinafore and dances in a cakewalk. The Great Fire can only move at right angles. The Great Fire goes from block to block at night and kisses stray cats in the moonlight, and the cats catch the Holy Ghost. The Great Fire sits in the balcony and yells at the picture. The Great Fire sings in a too loud voice. The Great Fire has plans for you. The Great Fire is going to take your daughter someplace. The Great Fire has a hoard of gold like a dragon. The Great Fire already lives next door and hides in the daytime. The Great Fire knows they don't want it here. The Great Fire is going to burn the city they built, and we will watch from the stone tower, and we will wait for it to finish, and we can wait a long time, and the fire can too. Thank you. So you all are so kind. You don't have to clap after every poem, you know. So the book is separated into 3 different sections: before, during, and after. And the first section that I just read from is about the kind of conditions in Chicago before the riot happened. And then the middle section is called During, which is about the riot itself. And there's a poem about the actual death of Eugene Williams. And it begins with this quotation. On Sunday, July 27th, 1919, there was a clash of white people and Negroes at a bathing beach in Chicago, which resulted in the drowning of a Negro boy. This poem is called Jump Rope. Little Eugene, Gene, Gene, sweetest I've seen, seen. His mama told him, them white boys mean. He didn't listen to what mama say. Went to the lake that July day. No, it goes like, little Eugene W., so sorry to trouble you. Rise, Eugene, rise. Calm your mama's cries. Just sit up and look around. Don't let them bury you down. No, it goes like, down, down, baby, down, down, the water's tugging. Sweet, sweet baby, don't make me let you go. Swallow, swallow, grab the sky. Swallow, swallow, dark. Swallow, swallow, grab the sky. Swallow, swallow, dark. Grandma, grandma, sick in bed. Call on Jesus 'cause your babies. No, it goes like, all dressed in black, black, black. All dressed in black, black, black. All dressed in. And he never came back. Thank you. So as Ken and Liesl both mentioned, The Negro in Chicago is this incredibly detailed accounting, over 800 pages of something that could have been more easily left unaccounted for, undiscussed. And one of the things that the writers did was they went through and figured out exactly how each person had actually been killed and tried to give a credible account of that. And so one of the people that they wrote about was a man named Samuel Bass. And they write, Samuel Bass, on account of the streetcar strike, was walking the 5½ miles from his work to his home when a gang of white men knocked him down 3 times and cut gashes in his nose and cheeks with their shoes. Bass hid behind freight cars till a Jewish peddler took him in his cart to State Street. A doctor was visited, but when he learned that Bass had no money, he turned him away without treatment, and he later died of his injuries of a brain hemorrhage. This poem is called This is a Map. This is a map of my city. Here are the places in my city where I dare not go. Here is where the electric wires gave out, and here is where I still had to make it home. And this is the first mile where I whistled the way my granny taught me to keep away the haints. And here is where a baby waved to me from a window. And here is the second mile where I heard the calls. And on this map, there is no third mile in this, my city, where I first prayed to die. And then, hearing a single cardinal over the din of their threats, changed my mind and prayed to live. And this is a map of my neighbor's city, where he traces a way through the mud each day, the squeal of old wood on iron heralding his arrival, a king of the streets, a conquering hero of nowhere. And this is a map of my body. This is the blood of my rivers. This is the bruise of my marshland. This is the sinew of my furthest ridge. And this is a map of the railroad. And if I could stand and walk, I could make it all the way back to my granny, pinching snuff and humming. And if she looked up, she would say, "Boy, my baby, where you been all this time?" Thank you. I wasn't going to read this poem, but I feel moved by the spirit of the occasion and the events of the day. All these days we having too many events, man. You can't keep track. You know, you like call your mother for a half hour and you come out and like another branch of the government has imploded, you know. The rule of the rule of the last few years is like, don't like stop paying attention for 30 minutes. Like if you exercise, like something crazy is going to happen. Anyway, this poem is called Sightseers, And in the report, The Negro in Chicago, as Liesl mentioned, there are these large groups of white men called, rather euphemistically referred to as athletic clubs. And they're very interesting. There's a whole other history that you should read on. They're very interesting because they had a kind of mutual patronage. They were kind of small-scale criminal organizations. Really, they were gangs that had a mutual patronage relationship with a local politician often. And so the politician would kind of look out for them, and they would kind of skirt the law, and then they could act as enforcers as part of Chicago's corrupt political machine. Richard Daley, Old Man Daley the first, was a member of one of these. He was one of the Hamburg gang. What's the second word? It's something common. The Hamburg Society, Hamburg Association, right. They called themselves the Hamburgers. And when asked directly, he always refused to say whether he had directly participated in the riots or not. It's kind of a yes or no question, but you know. Anyway, so in their analysis of the riots in the Negro in Chicago, the authors note that people would be involved in mob action that would result in someone's death, and they didn't always know that they had just participated in murdering someone until after it had happened. So they write, often the, quote, sightseers, and even those included in the nucleus, meaning the nucleus of this group of people, often the sightseers and even those included in the nucleus did not know why they had taken part in crimes, the viciousness of which was not apparent to them until well afterward. I also, for this poem, include a second quote from Hannah Arendt, who said, "The sad truth is that most evil is done by people who never make up their minds to be good or evil." This poem is called Sightseers. Just this once, I hope you'll forgive me for writing a somewhat didactic poem. I just didn't know how else to say that we live in a time of sightseers, standing on the bridge of history, watching the water go by, and there are bodies in the water, and the water has been dirty for so long, and the sightseers still drink from it. They buy special filters, and they smile. They have nice glasses and teacups. They put sugar in the dirty water that has our bodies in it. And there are sightseers seated beneath the Tower of Empire, peering up at the lights, and there are children in the tower, and the tower has been crooked for so long, and the sightseers still look at it. They find the lights enchanting. They meet up on the weekends. They have picnics in the plaza of the tower that has our children in it. And there are sightseers looking at the house of power, waiting to take a tour. And there are devils in the house, and the house has been wicked for so long, and the sightseers still worship it. They stand in front and take pictures. They marvel at the white pillars. They send postcards of the house that has the devils in it. And just this once, I hope you'll forgive me for asking you directly to forget the lovely water, to forget the charming pillars, because there are children in the tower. There are children in the tower. There are children in the tower, and they are dead already. Thank you. I'm going to read two more poems. You all have been incredibly kind. And then I look forward to being in conversation with Ken and then hearing some questions from you all. So this is a poem I've actually never read out loud at an event, but you seem like a fairly bookish crowd, and so I feel like you have the stamina for that. And so there are several poems in this book that take up the theme of the book of Exodus and the story of Exodus in the Bible. Because during the Great Migration, the allegory of Exodus was often invoked by Black people leaving the South for fairly obvious reasons. And the story of Exodus has always been especially important in African American history, first for people who were living in slavery, living in bondage, and then again during this period of the Great Migration. And for those of you who don't know, the story of Exodus is about Moses leading his people out of the slavery of Egypt through the desert. And so several of the poems in this book engage with the Exodus story. So this one is called Exodus 10. It begins with this quotation from any Hyde Parkers or Kenwood residents here? Oh, okay, a bunch of you. So during this time, there was a very active publication in Hyde Park and Kenwood called the Property Owners Journal, which was essentially a propaganda arm. Well, you'll see, I'll read it. So there's this quote from the Property Owners Journal. "There is nothing in the makeup of a Negro, physically or mentally, which should induce anyone to welcome him as a neighbor. The best of them are insanitary. Insurance companies class them as poor risks. Ruin alone follows in their path. From a 1920 issue of the Property Owners Journal. Exodus 10. And the Lord said unto the people, stretch out thy hands toward heaven, that there may be darkness over the city, even darkness which may be felt. And the people stretched forth their hands, and there was a thick darkness in all the city. It weighed heavy on the heads of saint and sinner alike, and the people smiled upon the darkness, and the darkness was good. For upon them the darkness was as burnt sugar, pleasing to the skin and sweet upon the lips, and the people delighted in the darkness. But upon the wicked the darkness was a plague, and beneath it they writhed in torment, weeping and calling for mercy. The thickness of the darkness was such that they saw not one another, neither rose any from their place for days. And the people found leisure, calling to one another through the darkness as in a child's game, and they found one another in laughter. And to them all noise was joyful in the darkness, so that each found the work of the Lord in the song of the sparrow, or the sigh of a sleeping infant, and it was good. But the wicked people were slothful, and found only misery in their repose. And the kings, their hearts hardened, called unto the people and said, go, get thee from us. Take heed to thyselves and leave the city. But the people stood in the darkness, and each reached with a staff toward heaven. And they spoke as one, saying then, nay, for the Lord our God is with us, and the city is granted unto us. And it shall be a city of darkness for all days to come. Thank you. Y'all are like, oh, that was a little bit scary. I don't know. Okay. Don't worry. It's just poems. Okay. Sometimes I write things and then I think, like, whenever the new era of McCarthyism does arrive upon us, I'm going to be like, oh, this is the one. This is where they're going to get me. This is the thing they're going to make me read out loud. And I'll be like, yes, I did say that. Okay, so I'm going to read one more poem, and I thank you so much for your time. This is a poem that I actually wrote before I started working on this book, but it became so abundantly clear that it should find a home here. It's a poem I wrote on the occasion of Emmett Till's birthday. And I had been thinking about how there's no reason Emmett Till should be famous. Emmett Till should have had the right to live a banal and unremarkable life. And maybe he would have gone on to become famous for something else. Like maybe Emmett Till could have been a famous architect or ballet dancer or like CEO of something. Maybe he could have done bad things. Maybe he could have been famous for something terrible, right? He could have been like Jeffrey Skilling of his time. But we'll never know because his life was ended in murder prematurely in a devastating way. And so I was imagining an alternate reality in which Emmett Till lived, and I saw him at Jewel, where everything important happens. Sometimes also at Mariano's important things happen. But most important things happen at Jewel. The 24-hour Jewel in particular is where most things of importance happen. So this poem is called I Saw Emmett Till This Week at the Grocery Store. And it begins with this quote from the Negro in Chicago, which again, I remind you, was written in 1922. And in 1922, the author said, there is no time to be lost. Other matters must be put aside for the moment and a solution reached for Chicago's greatest problem. I saw Emmett Till this week at the grocery store. Looking over the plums, one by one, lifting each to his eyes and turning it over slowly, a little earth, checking the smooth skin for pockmarks and rot, or signs of unkind days or people, then sliding them gently into the plastic, whistling softly, reaching with a slim woolen arm into the cart, he first balanced them over the wire before realizing the danger of bruising and lifting them back out, cradling them in the crook of his elbow until something harder could take that bottom space. I knew him from his hat. One of those fine pork pie numbers they used to sell on Roosevelt Road. It had lost its feather, but he had carefully folded a dollar bill and slid it between the ribbon and the felt, and it stood at attention. He wore his money. Upright and strong, he was already to the checkout by the time I caught up with him. I called out his name, and he spun like a dancer, candy bar in hand, looked at me quizzically for a moment before remembering my face. He smiled. Well, hello, young lady. Hello, so chilly today. I should have worn my warm coat like you. Yes, so cool for August in Chicago. How are things going for you? Oh, he sighed and put the candy on the belt. It goes. It goes. Thank you so much.
Did you want your,
How are you? Oh, this is way louder than the other mic. Hi.
is mine on too?
Yes.
Okay.
I'll just hold it
All
like
right.
this.
This is not scripted.
No.
So we're just going to talk a little bit, but we'd like to open it up as soon as possible. But I did want to start by asking Eve a question that comes out of one of the points I was making in my talk, noting that the poems I read and Davis's career point to a kind of claim about the inadequacy of the poem for the for realization of the issues that it raises. And you're a poet.
Yes,
but you're also,
allegedly.
But you're also a professor. You do other things. So
Yes.
I'd like to have you talk a little bit about why not just a poet? I mean, you're a good poet,
Thank you.
and people could be quite happy if that's all that you were, but you're not. So why not?
Yeah, that's such a great question, and I think that it's a question I get asked a lot, and it's much more interesting with the framing that I think you just provided, because I think it's a self-evident answer here, right? I mean, what you've given us today, and also in Liesl's talk, is a model of all these people. So Jun Fujita, who, by the way, his photographs, also several of them are included in this book. He was a poet who's this photographer who gives us this incredible documentary photography. W.E.B. Du Bois, right, literally writes everything. And I remember reading, as a 20-year-old me, read Dark Princess for your class as an undergraduate student. And I remember being really stunned by the fact that Du Bois was a novelist, right? Du Bois is a sociologist, novelist, sometime graphic designer, right? He does everything. A year before that, I had read Dust Tracks on a Road by Zora Neale Hurston and come to understand Hurston as, one of America's great novelists who's also an ethnographer and anthropologist. Frank Marshall Davis is a poet and a journalist, right? And so I think that what's more interesting, what is more peculiar, given these historical examples, given the exigency of the world in which we live, and given the incredibly short time that all of us have before we perish as individuals, let alone like society, that I don't understand why everybody doesn't just grasp desperately at whatever might seem available to them at some moment. So it has always seemed, and if you're into astrology, I'm also a Gemini, so maybe that's also part of it, but it's always, the idea of doing only one thing has always seemed peculiar or counterintuitive to me, because there are so many questions and they need so much from us, and they need so many things. And so, yeah, I think it's much easier to answer that question in the wake of this incredible lineage that you gave us.
Okay. A quick follow-up on that.
And then I have a question for you.
Yeah,
so.
okay. Well, I'm going to keep them
Okay.
firing at you. I don't want to answer anything. But one follow-up has to do with then the status for you of the poem as such. That is to say, I noticed in the that your voice,
Right.
the inflections, your singing are bringing a lot to the poem. And is there for you a sense of the distinctiveness of, say, the poem on the page? That is, well, I guess it's really, I'm not asking this quite as well as I'd like, but what thought do you have of your poetry or in individual poems as sort of artifacts, or is the sense of unfinishedness, or is there? I'm not saying that they're unfinished, but I mean, is there something more that you want evoked from the poems than their status as literary artifacts?
Well, I think that, we talked a little bit this evening about the Harlem Renaissance, and the Harlem Renaissance is a context in which writers are explicitly also referencing music, right? Referencing contemporary music of their own time, as well as a somewhat imagined African historical sense of music, right? I always love the Langston Hughes line where he says, "I like a record for Christmas, Bessie, Bop, or Bach," right? And so to me, the Black literary tradition has always been about thinking across across performance genre. And in my case, I came of age in a performance and slam culture. And so I'm often misidentified as a slam poet. I actually have never competed in a poetry slam in my life. I am just a Black person. But because I'm a Black person who writes poems, you're like, and she's a slam poet? I'm like, that never happened. You just made that up. But I did come of age in this performance culture that's very important to me. And so I think every poem that I write, to me, is simultaneously an artifact on the page and an embodied experience. And I often meet people who have only seen me read out loud, and they say, "Oh my God, I can't imagine reading that on the page. You would miss out on so much." And then people who've read the book and say, "Oh my God, I can't imagine not having time to sit and read through because you miss out on so much." And the poems that I choose to read, are poems that out loud are poems that I think lend themselves more to that embodied experience. But there are some of the poems in this book that I actually don't know how to read out loud just because of the way that they're constructed. So you'll have to purchase it or check it out from your local library in order to see what I mean. But yeah, I want to ask you a question, and I'll be expeditious so that we can get to the audience, if that's okay. I'm sorry I keep pointing at you like it's an inquisition. So I'm really intrigued by what you said about part of the condition of modernism being the relation between a broad catastrophe, like World War scale catastrophe that impacts, people from across all walks of life, and the production of literature. And I'm very convinced by your thesis in this lecture that we see a relation between this catastrophic event, more broadly the Red Summer, and the production of multiple forms of literature happening immediately thereafter. And I appreciate that you're including, sociological forms and journalism within the umbrella of literature there. So I have to ask the question, as we've been doing this year of 1919 programming, we're thinking about comparisons in the centennial era. So how do you see, and you're a reader of contemporary fiction, so how do you see, or do you see, a relationship between the contemporary catastrophes that are defining our times and the production of the literature that you're reading right now? Or do you think that's something that one can only determine in hindsight, like in 5 years? Do you see catastrophic literature being produced that's going to be defining of this era?
Very difficult question. I guess what I'll say is, I tend to be a literary historian in everything that I do, so I do look to, I see literary production as, in some sense, always embedded in a context as such. But what I think I would say about, and if we think about fiction by Black writers at the current moment, and I'm not as current as I perhaps ought to be.
And poetry, if you want.
Yeah,
films.
Fiction, poetry, and the like, is that there is clearly a preoccupation, and you take the 1619 project that the New York Times has championed in a certain way. There is actually a kind of tendency that I'm not even sort of particularly a fan of in some broad way, to think about history as continuity at the expense of discontinuity. As such, the idea of all time as being one time. 1619, 1919, 2019, no difference, except in the variety of ways in which these things are expressed. And
you're saying you're not a fan of this articulation?
Yeah, that strikes me as a huge mistake. It strikes me as a way of thinking of it. You could say it's almost Faulknerian, right, in its understanding of the past is not dead. It's not even
Right, it's not
past
even
as
past.
such. That part of what literature can lose by investing too heavily in the idea of legacy, something like whether it's repetition or it's, as I say, various manifestations of the same thing, right? If you think about Colson Whitehead's Underground Railroad, the idea being somehow that wherever you come out,
Right. There's
you're
a
kind of
peril.
in the same place,
Right.
right? And that strikes me as just kind of historically wrong. And so I feel that part of what we're seeing at the current moment is a literature sort of using history but struggling unsuccessfully, and maybe failing to actually be historical. And so,
Oh, man.
that's a controversial answer. I'm
Yeah,
sure
I
you
have
di-
so
I'm
many
sure you
follow-up
didn't expect
questions.
that,
No,
but
that was good.
that's
No, that
probably
was good. We'll go out to lunch and we'll talk about this because I'm not sure if I disagree or if I would just frame it differently, but we'll have to discuss further. Because now we're gonna take some questions from the audience. Is there a mic?
There's a
Oh,
mic
Liesl
over
has a
there.
mic, so you can raise your hand.
So we've got 2 mics, but if you could just wait until the mic comes to you, that'd be great. All right.
Is the rise of black literary growth in the 1920s really a result of the white press and the white intellectual establishment really ignoring or belittling the experience of the African Americans in 1919?
Okay. So is the growth really, just to get the question, you say, is the growth of African American literature in the 20s a result of the ignoring? No, I don't think so, right? That is to say, it strikes me that one feature of broadly speaking, say, thinking of the Harlem Renaissance, and there's a book by George Hutchinson called The Harlem Renaissance in Black and White, elaborating the kind of collaboration with black and white writers and readers across the notion of the development of the Harlem Renaissance, that you don't actually have an ignoring of black writers during this period. You actually have, and some would say, you could say, an unhealthy preoccupation with black writers by
fetishization.
writers, or fetishization as such. So, Langston Hughes, in his 1940 autobiography, The Big C, has a chapter called When Harlem Was in Vogue. And it's actually a kind of a searing criticism of the Harlem Renaissance, suggesting that it results from the exotic interests that so many whites had in what was going on in what was going on in Harlem. So it's not you could say it might be an effect of a certain kind of attention, or various kinds of attention being devoted to black writers during the Harlem Renaissance, but I don't think I would say it's ignoring of those writers.
Other questions? We're especially interested to hear from some teachers in this room. I know a lot of people here are teachers and educators thinking through how to teach this material, how to teach the history of 1919.
There's a question right up front here. Oh, there's one back there.
Hi. This question is for Eve. And so just reading through your poetry, I really admire the way that you're able to take very creative steps in terms of bring to light different ideas, such as the conversational tones that you use with the light and spacing that you have.
Thank you.
But one of the questions I have was from coming to the stockyard about the idea of the use of colors that you had.
Are you an English teacher?
No, I'm actually a student.
Great.
I'm just intrigued by it.
Great. Was that the question, or is there more?
The question was the idea of the red, yellow, and brown in that poem
Oh.
on page 15 or page 16.
Thank you. Well, actually, so that poem was one that I was thinking of when I was thinking about what is gained and lost by embodiment versus encountering the poem on the page, because, so this poem is called Coming from the Stockyards, and it's a persona poem from someone, a black person coming home from the stockyards on the streetcar. And the poem is in form, it's called an abecedarian, and so each line of the poem begins with a subsequent letter of the alphabet, which is something many of us do like in second grade, but it's actually an ancient Hebrew form of poetry. But most people don't know that until they get to the end, and like most readers, when they see an X and a Y and a Z, they're like, oh, wait a minute. But that's something that if I were to read the poem out loud is kind of lost, and the poem, the speaker in the poem is a teacher. He was a teacher in the South, and in coming to Chicago, he's not able to get work as a teacher, and so he ends up working in the slaughter, doing meat slaughtering at the Union stockyards. And he sees a white child on the streetcar, and has this kind of sweet encounter with him, becomes very nostalgic about his pupils back in the South, and teaching them to read. And so the content of the poem, which is that it's about a teacher remembering his students and teaching them to read, and the fact that it's an abecedarian is not incidental, which is difficult to convey in reading it out loud. None of these are answers to your question, which are about colors, and I think that I would categorize that as a very astute observation, and that you probably have better theses about than I do. And one of the Stuart Dybek, who's a great Chicago writer, I once saw him give a talk where he said, if you think about all the things that are in Moby Dick, all the dissertations that have been written about Moby Dick, thousands and thousands. I believe the Newberry has every edition of Moby Dick ever made. Yep, you can go see them. That's not a joke. That's really a thing that they have here. And at this point, thousands upon thousands more pages have been written about Moby Dick than the actual novel. And Stuart Dybek said, there's no way that Herman Melville really intended all those things, right? And so I think my job as a writer is to tell a story as best as I can, and then your job as a reader is to make those kinds of astute observations, and you can just be right without me saying so. So that sounds great. Whatever you think is great. Sounds good.
Right. Thank you so much.
Yeah. We had a question right here.
Thank you. I had a quick question for both of you, but Dr. Warren in particular. I think Dr. Ewing, you were trying to tease him out of this. Are we in the midst of another kind of a renaissance of African-American writers? And how does that play in with the idea we're in a war, as we were in 1919, just finishing, and we're also in an economic expansion as we were subsequent to the war? How do you see, and how would you look back, if you would, on where this renaissance is, and how does it play in with the others?
Okay, yeah, thanks for the question. As Liesl indicated, one of my most recent single-authored book is called What Was African American Literature, and the was is operative here for a thesis that it's been somewhat controversial, and the argument is simply that, although Black American writers wrote literary texts over the course of the 19th century, continue to write texts now, that the concept of an African American literature, which is to say the belief that Black writing itself constituted a literature, to be set apart in some sense from American literature, really didn't emerge as a concept until the later part of the 19th century, with the rise of disfranchisement across the South, the imposition of Jim Crow, which effectively silenced politically, after the sort of efflorescence of the Farmers Alliance, Black sharecroppers and farm workers and farmers participating in populist party, third-party politics, and challenging Southern democracy in the South, and which led to violent reprisals and disfranchisement from the early 1890s through the early part of the 20th century. That effective political silencing actually created a stage in which, for more elite, mostly Northern, not exclusively writers, it became possible, and in some sense seemingly necessary, for them to produce literature that they presented and that was taken as representative of the race as such, that there was a coherent, organic race that could be represented by literature, and that representation of literature, the production of literature, was crucial to the battle against Jim Crow. And part of my argument, and one can see it in the literature and debates of the 1950s, is that as the legal foundations for Jim Crow began to crumble, writers had sort of had this discussion all along, but began to have it more crucially, were questioning to what extent could literary writing be taken to sort of represent the race as such, or to do work on behalf of the race as such, because in some sense, there's no race as such. If you think about the black population, Cedric Johnson, a political scientist at UIC, has pointed out that the black population in the United States is larger than the entire population of Canada. So the idea that a literature can actually kind of represent a group as diverse and as varied as that is, you could say, something that we ought to sort of question. It made sense, even though it was really the literature. Part of the point of the race relations, and what I made in alluding to the race relations regime, was that what that really represented was, or constituted, was the idea that a set of individuals, whether you're talking about Du Bois's Talented Tenth, or the writers of the Harlem Renaissance, could in some substantive way serve as spokespersons for this group. That seemed to be a sort of necessary gesture in terms of challenging Jim Crow, and the structure of that was such that under Jim Crow, it was the case that the achievements of a black elite, say, to be a professor at the University of Chicago, you could say if one were that in 1925, as such, it's an entirely different thing than being I'm a professor at the University of Chicago, big frickin' deal, right? It pays well.
There are costs.
But it's a job, right? So part of the point that to get to the answer to your question is that what we're seeing now is, in some sense, you could say the efflorescence of this. You could say the success of the battle against Jim Crow, the increasing number of black Americans who have access to higher education and the institutions for literary production, who are able to produce literature in a way that they, we can say more so than before. But for me, there's no reason to see that as a distinctly black phenomenon. A marvelous book on the rise of creative writing programs by a professor at Stanford, Mark McGurl, makes the point that the most significant feature of literary production, it's an argument, I wouldn't say a point, he makes an argument that the most significant feature of American literary production over the last half century has been the rise of creative writing programs. And so many of the African American writers that we think of as sort of distinctive features of their race are really products of the same kind of programs that have produced many of our major writers. So we have an extraordinary literature at the moment, of sort of extraordinary American literature, but McGurl's argument is that black, Latino, white, it's all program literature. And I think there's a kind of, I'm sort of maybe simplifying a little bit, but so that would be my point. It points to things other than the usual things we might think of as a sort of racial phenomenon. I think there are other institutional phenomena that it would be important to attend to.
I'll just, I was going to say briefly address that and then calls to mind the lie that is brevity. So, I am not a cultural historian, and so I hesitate to, but I do believe that we are in the midst of a black cultural renaissance. Right? I don't love the word renaissance because it suggests rebirth, right? But I would say a black cultural movement of note. Certainly, one might argue at a micro level, just in Chicago, right? But I also think broadly, and for me, the Harlem Renaissance is instructive, but I also think frequently about the Black Arts Movement. And for me, as a young person, when I first learned about the Black Arts Movement, what was so instructive was the understanding that any effective political movement has to have an aesthetic dimension, and that there is a symbiotic relationship between an aesthetic movement and a political movement, right? That they play into each other. And further, that they're not, as I said earlier about kind of music in the Harlem Renaissance, they're not happening in isolation, right? That folks are talking to each other, folks are hanging out. And in the Chicago context, when I talk to visitors from out of town or show people around or talk to them, the thing that they always comment on is the synchronicity between hip hop communities, poetry communities, and activist communities in Chicago, right? That there's a relationship between, that we're in kinship relation to one another. But I think more broadly, I think about the scope of the art that has been produced in this country, the scope, scale, and visibility of what I think could otherwise on its own be considered like very difficult art, right? And the relationship between that and the kind of post Trayvon Martin, and then later like post Ferguson moment. And I think about, in the visual arts, I think about Kehinde Wiley, I think about Carrie James Marshall, I think about Kara Walker, right? In film, I think about Barry Jenkins, I think about Ava DuVernay. I think about what it means for a film like Moonlight to win Best Picture, right? In writing, I think about several writers, many of whom, like myself, do not have MFAs, right? People like Ta-Nehisi Coates, people like Jesmyn Ward, people like Terrence Hayes, Colson Whitehead. I even think about something like Lemonade, which is that Beyonce, who is the most prominent and visible pop culture artist of our time, right? Someone who, much like the Beatles, I think you could argue makes a turn from being a fairly palatable pop culture, object to taking on a quite more, political and avant-garde stance. Beyonce made a 60-minute experimental film with a bunch of poems in it and released it, and people like binge watched it, right? If you have not watched Lemonade and really looked at what you're watching and really thought about it, that would have been very much at home in an MFA program as somebody's final project. To Pimp a Butterfly wins a Pulitzer Prize, right? Kendrick Lamar is a Pulitzer Prize winning. I think about that every day. When I feel sad, I wake up and brush my teeth, and I'm like, Kendrick Lamar has a Pulitzer Prize, by golly, and that's amazing. And we cannot decouple that from the movement for Black lives. We cannot decouple that from what seemed to me, again, perhaps from a naive position, historically unprecedented ways in which we interrogate what Black freedom even means and for whom, right? The way we recenter Black disabled people, Black undocumented people, Black trans people, Black queer people, right? All these folks that historically have been marginalized from these movements, and saying, how do they take center stage politically and aesthetically, and how are those two things related? To me, that speaks to what I would consider a kind of the beginnings, at least, of a cohesive cultural movement of note. But, there's nothing more perilous than trying to identify the historical, attributes of the time in which you live. But that's just how it seems to me.
Thank you. Thank you for that, both of you.
Thank you.
Ken and Eve, you guys are amazing. We're going to have to move you out into the hall where there are books for sale and to be signed. Thank you all for being here.
Thank
Come
you,
back
Ken.
again.
Thank you all for coming.
Yes, give it up for Eve and Ken. Thank you.